Chris the Tray, everyone.
Wow. I'm not an Olympian anymore. Bonjour, Indinoy Maganadug. Chris Kosh and Nikashin. That is hello, all of my relatives. You can call me Chris. So I said that in two languages. Bonjour, Indinoy Maganadug is the hello, all of my relatives. That is in Anishinaabe-Moan, or Anishinaabe, or Ojibwe-Moan, or Ojibwe, or Chippewa. All different names for the same thing, which is the language of my people, the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. And then Chris Kosh and Nikashin is you can call me Chris in Michif, which is the other language of the Little Shell. It's Michif, which is the language of the Métis people. And we're going to talk about what all that was. It's like I can't tell you where I was a week ago if I don't take my calendar out and look, because it's been that busy. And I made kind of the Olympia reference because, you know, the book came out a month and a half ago, and of course I did these triumphant events all over Montana, and I felt like a rock star. And then I went to the West Coast thinking that, okay, now it's back to the reality of book tours, where often you're talking to a couple booksellers and maybe one person in off the street and anybody that you have with you. And I've been very fortunate that that has not been the case. I've had good crowds everywhere, you know, which to me is two things. One, like for the first time in 500 years, it's a pretty good thing to be an indigenous person in the United States or in North America, because it really hasn't been for a few centuries. And I am being uplifted by the work of so many other people who never had an opportunity to have the kind of response that people like me are allowed to get. So that is important. The other thing, you know, Mark mentioned that newsletter, and I like that's driving everything. Both book sales, people showing up all around the country. You know, I have readers, and it's like a sea change in how people are interacting with writers. And I kind of thought that would be the case, but it's been overwhelmingly proved over and over again that that is where most of my interested people are coming from, and they're coming in with some knowledge of what I'm talking about, because, you know, a lot of this overlaps into that newsletter. And, you know, I feel like I live up to that more than I do the poet laureate thing, like the irritable Métis part more than poet laureate. And the funny thing about those books too is, like, when I started my writing career, my goal was, and it was based on people who came out of Livingston. You know, this is such a rich place for art and literature, and so many of my influences lived here. And my motto is that I want to publish a novel, and I want to publish a book of nonfiction, and I want to publish poetry. And thinking that the thing that was most likely not going to happen was going to be the poetry. And yet, 2 books of poetry showed up before anything else did. Though this Becoming Little Shell has been in the works for a long time. It's just funny. Now I have to figure out a way to, you know, convince someone to publish a novel if I have one in me. The way these things work is I'm going to read kind of a condensed version of the introduction, because it, I think, kind of lays the groundwork for what the book is about. And then I'll talk a little bit, but I really want to get to like Q&A as quickly as I can, because I suspect, you know, there are people in here who have read the book or people who are interested, and you come here with questions. And I would love to get a conversation going about anything related to this book. And to me, that's what's fun, is when we start sharing our own experiences and perspectives and stuff. So that's the plan. It's a midsummer morning in 2022 in western Montana, and dark clouds boil and roil and threaten thunderstorms. After days of swelter, the precipitation is welcome, but the threat of wildfire by lightning is real. I'm driving my gray 1999 Nissan Frontier pickup. I merge onto Interstate 90 westbound, where it intersects with Montana Highway 93 at the western edge of Missoula. These two routes, I-90 east-west, 93 north-south, are swarmed with tourist traffic every summer. These yearly visitors are here because this place is beautiful. The valley formed by the confluence of the Blackfoot, Bitterroot, and Clark Fork rivers is bordered by rolling mountains. Below the conifer-covered tree line, despite summer settling in with a vengeance, their slopes still show a hint of spring's green where they aren't patched in yellow arrowleaf balsam root. Indigenous words are on my mind today. There are countless shiny cars, hulking SUVs, and gigantic pickups pulling trailers loaded with canoes and kayaks and bicycles. I note names like Tacoma and Denali on their bumpers. Same with RVs called Yukon and Winnebago. There are many others too, Indian names all in a place not that many Indians remain. I've thought about Indians my entire life. I grew up with the vague knowledge my father's side of the family was Indian, Chippewa specifically, as my grandmother would speak of it at times. I have a dim memory of being 4 years old and sitting on the faded linoleum kitchen floor of our little farmhouse in Huson, assaulting a coloring book with crayons. When asked why I depict a pair of children with red skin, I say it's because they're Indians. My visiting grandmother, Ruby Catherine Doney Latreille, sitting at the table asks, "Is my skin red?" "No, but I'm an Indian, and so are you." I was very young, and now I'm not, but the memory has stuck with me. It wasn't until my grandfather died, just shy of 83 years of age, in late September 1996, that pieces started falling into place. I was 29 years old. A decade earlier, fresh out of high school, two friends and I headed west on the same Interstate 90 I'm traversing today, on our way to Seattle to become rock stars. I hadn't seen my grandparents since making the move. By 1996, I was married with a 3-year-old son who would never meet his great-grandfather, living closer to Tacoma than Seattle, and working a job that required a long, traffic-infested commute that was slowly killing my will to live. The dreams of rock and roll glory were over. I like to tell people my bandmates and I arrived in Seattle with bags full of spandex and leather when the city was on the cusp of dressing all their musical heroes in flannel and ripped jeans. In 1996, I made the drive to Plains, Montana for the funeral. Though I barely knew my grandfather, I was one of the pallbearers. It was a beautiful fall day in early October. I left my Washington home in the wee hours of morning, crossed Snoqualmie Pass eastbound through the jagged and magnificent Cascade Mountains at sunrise, then blew through the croplands of eastern Washington as the day expanded in my windshield. The sun was bright, the foliage was changing to vivid reds and yellows, and the air was crisp and clean the entire way. Arriving at the small Catholic church in Plains, I was amazed to find the nave crowded with Indians. I took my seat in the front row beside my dad and stared around in a state of puzzled awe. During the service, which I barely remember, it seemed to be more about Jesus than my grandfather, Dad kept poking me in the ribs and trying to make me laugh. When we exited the church and prepared to join the procession to the cemetery, Dad leaned in and asked, "So, what did you think about all those Indians?" "There were a lot of them," I said, for lack of a better answer. What I didn't say was how astounded I was. Something my dad and his father had in common was the denial of any indigenous heritage. Suggesting my dad was native made him angry. I could never understand why. I was the opposite. I wanted to be Indian. I wanted that identity, and I took it for myself, even if it had to be largely locked up. To me, it was cool. Who wouldn't want to be Indian? Who wouldn't want to be Chippewa? My grandfather's funeral was a turning point in my curiosity about my family history. Here was a collection of people I'd never known but was clearly connected to. Who were they? Why didn't I know them? Why was I never allowed to know them? What was our family story? Excuse me. I went home with more questions, only now I could see much more clearly where I came from, even if nobody in my family talked about it. Whenever anyone asked my dad about other Latreilles in Montana, and there are many of us, he would deny any relation. I never heard him utter the words Little Shell, Rocky Boy, Turtle Mountain, or even Chippewa that I can recall, nor Métis, all words for people and places critical to my life now. My dad spent his life denying his indigenous heritage and, through his choice, mine as well, sometimes vehemently. Referring to my dad as Indian in any way, in most contexts, bordered on fighting words. If pressed, His calmest response was to refer to the entire idea of Indianness as complete bullshit. When he passed away in 2014, Dad left me with a lifetime of questions about who he was and where he came from. Know who we are, where we come from. I'm certain he had the answers to many of these questions, but he chose to take them with him to his grave. I decided I would do what I could to find them on my own. If not from him, then through people who lived a similar experience, through the story of our people. This book is an attempt to answer some of those questions, to tell the story of my own family heritage, certainly, and why my dad felt the way he did about his heritage. If I've learned anything at all, it's that I'm not the only one to grow up in these kinds of circumstances. I'm also not alone in trying to find my way back to who I was all along, a proud Indian. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a historian. I don't have an academic bone in my body. I'm a storyteller, and this is a story that needs telling. I feel compelled to share the story of the Métis people of Montana with the world, to tell the story of the Little Shell tribe, the longtime landless Indians of Montana, because it's clear we're largely unknown, not just to the wider world, but even in Montana, the first state to recognize us as a legitimate tribe, despite our centuries-old association with a larger indigenous family. Like the stories of all indigenous tribes of the Americas, it's a sad story. It is also a triumphant story of the baddest buffalo people the world has ever seen. And it's a story still unfolding. So that is my condensed introduction. And now I can take my glasses off and actually look at you. This is the part I like. I've gotten so used to just talking that reading, I feel like my arm is tied behind my back and I'm in a boxing match, because I love the connection of being able to look at people and read how people feel about it. So I need to begin by saying, well, who are the Métis? So the Métis are a recognized indigenous cultural group, recognized in Canada as one of their 3 pre-nationhood indigenous peoples, along with the First Nations and the Inuit. Recognized thusly in Canada, but not recognized in the United States at all. So while my tribal ID for the Little Shell says I'm Chippewa Cree, which I am, it should say I'm Métis, because that's really what I am. And we rose out of the first, we're a post-contact indigenous group, in that our genesis begins after the Europeans come. And this is the late 1600s, when a couple dudes are granted a charter from a guy named Prince Rupert in England, and they get this chunk that is the size of what Canada, a third of Canada is today, called Rupert's Land. And they start this trading company called the Hudson's Bay Company. And they start out to the east of the Great Lakes, and the first people to arrive in what is the Red River Settlement, which is now Winnipeg, Manitoba. That's the original Red River Settlement. And in the late 1600s, the voyageurs show up there, and they've established these trading posts. And the only way that Native people will trade with anybody outside of their clan or their band or their tribe, whatever you want to call it, is through family relationships, intermarriage. And that worked within the tribes themselves, but long before European people came. So when those first traders show up, that's the only way to establish trading relationships that are initially beneficial to everyone. And those original marriages between European men and Native women who had complete agency in this interaction. It wasn't like they were being married off. They recognized the value to their family, and that was their role, as well as leadership roles within their own communities, is these marriages. And so the initial first few generations and the mix of these cultures and ways of living is the rise of the Métis people. So our flag flew before the Canadian flag ever did. We predate all of that stuff. And if anybody was to ask me, why I really feel like the United States doesn't recognize the Métis people, it comes down to what everything always comes down to with the United States, whether it's in North America or anywhere else. It's land and resources that belong to somebody else, and the United States wealthy want it for themselves. That's always been the story of this continent, and we see that story playing out all over the world. So there is all kinds of land that the United States would have to reconcile with if they recognize the Métis as a distinct culture, as a people that they need to honor with return of things that were stolen from them in the first place. So that's who the Métis people are. The Little Shell are the most recently federally restored tribe in the United States. And that happened in December of 2019, after 150 plus years of trying to prove 80,000 pages of documents, prove to the United States who we knew we always were all along. And I like to tell people that we received that restoration like on a Thursday, and by Monday I had the numbers 574 tattooed on my knuckles, because we were the 574th federally recognized restored tribe in the United States. There's a couple hundred more that could be as well. And the question becomes, well, why were you not recognized? Well, the United States, most of the tribes who were federally recognized achieved that relationship through treaties between sovereign nations. In 1871, after the Civil War, the United States decided, you know what, we're going to stop treating these dirty savages as sovereign nations, and we're either going to get out of the way or get run over. And we were one of those people that they tried to run over. So from 1871, if you hadn't already signed a treaty with the United States, you were never going to, and you're probably never going to get that level of federal recognition. So for 100 years, that was the case. And it wasn't until 1978 that the United States recognized that, okay, we have all of these tribes that don't have, the same relationship with the state and the feds the way that all of these other tribes do. So we need to figure out a way to allow them a path to get recognition. So that's when the Little Shell became the Little Shell, was 1978. Prior to that, like pre-1850s, 1870s, 1890s, actually 1883, I think it was, we were the Pembina Chippewa. So the Pembina Chippewa we're kind of the southwestern edge of the whole Chippewa Ojibwe nation, which if we think of the Great Lakes, most people associate the Ojibwe with the Great Lakes. And like, how are there Ojibwe people in Montana? Well, we were on that kind of southern western edge, and we weren't rice foragers, we were buffalo hunters. And we were really, 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 really good at it. And that is how we ended up in Montana, is going out to the Front Range and back twice a year hunting buffalo, going all the way down into the Yellowstone ecosystem, hunting buffalo. Everywhere we could find them, we hunted them. And as they thinned out and it was harder and harder to find, just like all the other Northern Plains tribes, created all this extra conflict because you had multiple people all vying for the same dwindling resource. And we were part of that. And we are named after Chief Little Shell, who was the hereditary chief of the Pembina Chippewa at the time that the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota was formed, and the Pembina Chippewa became essentially the Turtle Mountain Chippewa. Little Shell wasn't actually his name. Little Shell was a hereditary title, and he was the third after his father and his grandfather. His real name was Ayabwewitung, which means he who rests on the way. And we chose his name to be the name of our tribe when we consolidated all these different landless groups of people who were trying to get, sometimes working together, sometimes working at odds. We consolidated as Little Shell to create our path to restoration, and that's what happened. So we're named after a specific individual. I hear people sometimes in the way that, natives like to kind of be laterally violent against each other, claiming to be like, well, my mother was a full-blood Little Shell. And it's like, well, if you know anything about Little Shell, you're not full anything, just like anybody else. And so that's who the Little Shell, we're comprised of Métis people. We have done great things since our federal restoration. I'm really proud of the efforts that our tribal council have made. I have some disagreements. I care more about culture and language, I think, than they do. But we've bought a bunch of land in the Great Falls area that we have not turned over to the feds as trust land yet. We just own it like anybody else can own land. That we're piecing together we're building housing for people. We've restored a big state-of-the-art healthcare facility. We, for the first time ever, had our powwow on our own land under our own brand new arbor that we just finished just in time for the powwow just this last summer. So all of these things are happening. And we get so caught up as Native people. I'm like, well, we used to do this, we used to do that. Yeah, we used to do all that shit, but we're doing all this shit now. and we're making impact on our community. And that makes me as proud as the knowledge that for generations we didn't lose a single conflict with the Canadians, the Americans, or other indigenous tribes because of the organization of our Buffalo Brigades and our Red River Carts and all of these things that were part of our culture that has been largely erased. And this book exists to begin the rolling back of that erasure. And I would love to answer questions, because I never know what direction to go, because I could go any number of directions. Yes. Scott.
Could you talk a little bit about Louis Riel and what he tried to pull off and what happened to it as a result?
Yes. First, I want to say, if not for Scott McMillian and Montana Quarterly, that's where I first started learning about the little show, and I was trying to figure out where I came from. And I also got my start as a writer in Montana, writing for Montana Quarterly. So that is part of why I love being here. Scott, I am eternally grateful to you. What's that?
It was you.
Louis Riel is literally the most written about political figure in Canadian history. Still a lightning rod of opinion for people, I'm not a math guy, like 140 years after he was hung for sedition against a queen he was not even a citizen of anymore. So Louis Riel led rebellion really isn't even the right word, efforts to create Métis homelands in Canada. So Manitoba exists because of Louis Riel and an effort to make it a Métis homeland, but the Canadian government were able to kind of pry that away from him, and he went into exile in Montana in the late 1870s, and he was living in Helena. And while he was in the Lewistown area, Lewistown was founded in 1879 by a group of 20 Métis families who had come down from the Red River and were on the Milk River for about a decade, and then the army drove them out. And they went to Spring Creek in the Judith Basin, and that's where Lewistown is now. Louis Riel was there, and he drafted a petition for a Métis homeland in central Montana that both sides of my grandfather and grandmother's grandparents signed that petition, the men, of course, and it didn't happen. And then he was in Helena and became an American citizen, was involved in city politics, then went to teach at St. Peter's, the mission up by Cascade. And I like to picture the vision of these steely-eyed Métis buffalo hunters who come and say, we need you to come back to Saskatchewan because the Canadians are hassling us and we need a place again. So Louis Riel goes to Canada. It's called the Northwest Rebellion of 1885, and they end up losing, and Louis is hung. So his whole thing was, he's like one of the most famous people and necessary people in Métis history. And I love in Canada because you can buy these t-shirts that say like keeping it real or the Riel thing, the Riel deal, all of these stupid but awesome dad puns on his name. But yeah, he's this incredibly important person, not just to the Métis, but also what that stirred up in Canada. So the Métis are, much more, they've had their struggles in Canada as well, and there's all kinds of politics currently in Canada about who is really Métis and who isn't. And I stay out of that. The idea being, Métis, if you see with a small m, that's literally the French word for mixed. And if you see with a capital M, you're referring to a specific culture. And we, of the Little Shell, and the Manitoba Métis Federation and most of the Métis Nation are Red River Métis, which nobody disputes are legitimate, original, culturally associated Métis people. So that's Louis Riel, and I think as you hear a lot more of him now in the United States than you did even 5 years ago, 10 years ago especially. And it's part of this kind of rising awareness that we have in the United States, but also in Canada, about the contributions of Indigenous people to all of these different things that have happened that would be erased if not for a few key individuals, and they're usually descendants of these important people. Anything else? Does that answer your question at all?
Absolutely, thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
Last time you were here, you talked about the Métis being traders.
Yeah.
And traveling between the other main tribes in Montana. Can you speak about that some more, about how that kind of worked with the economy of it and the cultural mixing of that work?
Yeah, so I refer somewhat flippantly, but I'm dead serious, that Métis represent the perfect North American. Because for the better part of 100 years, we represented what it could look like if you were mixed of all of these different cultures that are living together and for the most part getting along, which we seem incapable of doing now. But for a long time we did, because we are largely, the result of mostly French with some Scottish and English traders marrying into Ojibwe primarily and Cree tribes, but also Nakota, who we most of us know as Assiniboine, and all these other tribal communities. It was this polyethnic group of people who manifested all mixed together as the Métis, who the Michif language is largely a mix of a few French and Gaelic nouns with a whole bunch of indigenous verbs. And the dialect of Michif changes depending on who is kind of the dominant language speaking culture in that area. So in some places it's mostly Cree, in other places it's mostly Ojibwe. And we also, like my great-great-grandfather, Mose Latreille, who him and his wife Susie were part of that original 20 families who founded Lewistown in 1879, and their deep Catholic ardor for each other generated like 13 kids, and those 13 kids generated however many grandkids and however many great-grandkids. So when my dad, who could spin a yarn, said that we weren't related to all of the other Latreilles, he was utterly full of shit, because we are all related. You would be amazed how many people I encounter who say, was Mose, are you related to Mose? I'm like, yeah, that's my great-great-grandfather. And they're like, mine too. I mean, we are everywhere. But he, first, among all of these great, there's a chapter about Mose that ended up on the cutting room floor of Becoming Little Shell, because he had this really interesting life and all these different things he did. And he was an interpreter for the Army, because like so many, there was Fort McGinnis outside of Lewistown, which all that's left of it is a few rocks piled up, out kind of by Gilt Edge, all these little towns around Lewistown. He spoke half a dozen languages. So, if he could speak Crow, he could speak Lakota, he could speak Dakota, he spoke Michif, French, English, all of these things that enabled them to interact with all of these communities living in central Montana and southern Montana and western Montana. And those, we invented what most historians consider the first evidence of wheel use by indigenous people on the northern plains, and that's the Red River cart, which is this two-wheeled wooden conveyance that each one could carry up to 900 pounds. And we would take those carts out on buffalo hunts, anywhere from 20 or 30 to a couple hundred to over 1,000. And you don't mess with a cart train with a bunch of heavily armed excellent horsemen hunters, moving in military formation around this. And we had Catholic priests with us, so we spread Catholicism through Montana, which was kind of an exercise in shooting ourselves in the foot to a certain extent, also based on the long-term ramifications of that. But to kind of get back to your question, those cart trains and the guiding we did and all of these things bolstered that interaction that kind of knit all of these communities together. And if there's one thing that I've learned in the last 10 or 15 years of kind of immersing myself in this, is the depth of the kinship network that binds all of our tribes together. So we being kind of the dominant Western culture, like to try and shove things into boxes And we talk about tribal territories, what I call like the zoo enclosure view of tribal land. It's like, you're on the Missouri, and it's like, on your right, we have the Mandan and the Hidatsa and the Arikara, while coming up on the left, we have the Cheyenne. And yeah, it was kind of like that, but there was tons of movement. And with that movement came trading, came some fighting too, but also intermarriages. So like Azures and Donis you find enrolled on other tribes all over the state. And those are mighty Métis family names. And you have Crow people married to people on the Flathead Reservation. All of this, that's not new. We've always been doing that. And that's kind of how those languages move around also. Does that answer your question? I mean, we were all over the landscape. Yes.
I love the Daily Journal.
Thank you.
And the book. I was fascinated with Hill 57.
Yeah.
Is that what that was?
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear more about it.
So he's asking about Hill 57. So Hill 57, there's a chapter about it in Becoming Little Shell. It's like the capital of the Little Shell, I think is what I call it. And it's this hill, this big bald rock, kind of on the northwestern edge of Great Falls, that is called Hill 57 because there was, back in the 20s, there was this guy who worked for Heinz who was a pickle salesman. And his family would go up and they would picnic up on top of this hill, and they would whitewash rocks, kind of like we have the M in Missoula, or I don't know if there's one around here, to mark a hillside. And he had a big 57 as like kind of an OG billboard for his pickle business. But then it was far enough on the outskirts of Great Falls that there were a lot of Indians living there, and it was known as being just horrific for poverty and illness and all of these things. There was no electricity. There was one water pump for the whole community. And so there's this documentary even about the Hill 57 Indians and the poverty there. And a lot of the land that the Little Shell have been buying is on Hill 57. Our tribal community center is like right at the base of Hill 57. It's like a spiritual place for us now. Because the point being that like if you go somewhere and you're only looking for poverty and you're only looking for illness, you're going to find it in a community like that. Well, there was a reason why there was a lot of illness there, because with the path to federal recognition in 1978, the United States passed a bunch of other Indian-related legislation, one of which being the Indian Religion Act, which finally allowed us to practice our traditional ceremonies. So it wasn't until 1978 that we could even do that. I had a stack of KISS records already in 1978. So that is like recent history. So Hill 57, for generations prior to that, served as this place. It was on the outskirts, nobody was going to bother you, and people would come there to do traditional ceremonies, sweats, medical procedures, what we would call medical procedures, traditional medicine. So that's why there's a lot of sick people, because everybody who's sick who wants to be treated traditionally, the only place they can go is Hill 57. It's like Great Falls, there's like 60 different tribes recognized as living in Great Falls. It's not because Great Falls is a great place to live as a native person. It's because this history has been established, is that was a place where you could go because the feds would leave you alone. The state would leave you alone. As long as you weren't bothering anybody, they weren't going to hassle you. So it gained this reputation as being this place of illness and poverty, when in reality, it was kind of where we made our last stand. And if not for that place, we probably wouldn't still exist as who we are. So that hill that has the big GF in Great Falls, that's Mount Royal, and Hill 57 kind of comes off the backside of it if you're ever curious to see where it is. Anything else? Yes.
So, we spoke briefly before you started about, the Peter Bowen series,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the central themes of his series is the music
Yes.
and the distinct Métis music
Mm-hmm.
as an integral part of that culture. Is that fiction, or is that still very much alive and part of the Métis and Little Shell culture?
Yeah, so he's asking about the Métis music and kind of some of the essential components of what Métis culture is. And yes, fiddle music especially, was adopted by Métis and is still a big part, like you know, when we have festivals and things like that. Jig dancing and fiddle music is a big part of it. But even that is a mix, because you've got a fiddle sometimes over the top of what we would consider a hand drum or whatever. And our powwows, one day we're jigging and fiddling, and the next day we're doing a grand entry, just like every other tribe in Montana. So the fiddle music is a huge part of it. And there's great illustrations by these people from back in the late 1700s, these military guys showing this room full of people with all the furniture pushed to the walls, and people out on the floor of this cabin dancing, and there's fiddlers. Like if this was a Métis celebration, when I was done shooting my mouth, we'd put all the chairs up and someone bust out a fiddle and we'd start going after it here, and I get asked all the time if I know jig dancing. I don't. I'm a mosher. I'm not a jigger. I like to make that very clear. I'm built for moshing, not jigging. So there's that. There's the sash. The Métis sash is the very colorful sash that is a signifier of Métis people. Charlie Russell, everything he learned to be bad at as a cowboy, he learned from Métis people. And you see little Easter egg references to Métis in a lot of his artwork. And he had a sash. The statue of him out in Great Falls, he's wearing his sash. And if you go to the museum, his actual sash is in a case there. The Red River cart is another thing. And so there's all of these little things that are indicators that anthropologists use to say, yes, this was a specific and unique culture because they were the only ones who did this stuff. But yes, music was a huge part of it and remains that. And it's also one of those things like language that is kind of slipping away, because there's not a lot of young people taking up fiddle, and that cultural practice is one of those things kind of teetering on the brink that different groups are trying to restore as well. Anybody else? Yes.
Just expand on that a little bit. Is the fiddle music very like Celtic type, or does some Indian somehow?
It's kind of Celtic.
Yeah.
I mean, if this book had a soundtrack, it's the soundtrack to The Last of the Mohicans. And that song, The Kiss, I listened to it on the way here. It's very much that, really jaunty.
Uh-huh.
Just between us, I don't really like it. I admire the ability, but I love the drums. I love a big powwow drum and all that, but it is Irish, Celtic, Scottish, because that's who we learned it from.
Right.
And when we couldn't afford to trade for actual fiddles, we learned to make our own. So even the sound of it changed based on the means we used to actually make the instrument. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm wondering, I have your book, I haven't read it.
Do you have all three of my books?
Yeah, two.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
I'm
I
anti-capitalist.
sent them to the other one, so.
That's great.
I'm wondering, if you can talk about how, being sort of young, grown up, and have this heritage that, was suppressed, right?
Yes.
Sort of how you felt then and how you might have changed personally and grown or whatever to be the man you are now,
Mhm.
through this whole process of wanting to know more. Because that was a decision point there. It's like you could have gone along with the suppression and
Yeah.
however that made you feel and what it did to you to become part of a people and culture.
So the question for those in the back who probably couldn't hear it is basically, how did I go from my happy childhood to being an irritable Métis? I'm profoundly changed by it.
Yeah.
Profoundly changed by it. And, there's a chapter in the book where I meet Nicholas Ruman, who was my mentor. And, at that point, all I'd known was an issue of Montana Quarterly that I still have, talking about when our community center had been built and the story of who we are as Little Shell and the efforts to be federally recognized. And this is 2013, maybe even 2012. So that's when I was first starting to get an inkling that, well, these guys are in Lewistown, and I know my dad was born in Lewistown, and I know his family lived in Lewistown. So all of this stuff just started to unfold, and I have been profoundly changed by it. And it's the work that I'm going to be doing related to this for the rest of my life. It's just that. And part of it is because, Nicholas was so important to us in our efforts to get our federal restoration, and he passed away 6 months before that happened. And he was the guy that if anybody wanted anybody to go talk about the Métis or talk about the little show or whatever, he did it. And with him gone, it came to me. And all of this work I do as poet laureate, as this book or whatever, it is all about telling this story. So it is, my life now is profoundly different than it was 10 or 12 years ago, and who I am in my community. And I've just recently, I haven't talked about this much, and in fact, I told my mom over double front chicken. Another article I wrote for Scott from Montana Quarterly was about Missoula's double front chicken. I met with my mom for lunch on my way out here today. And I told her because I have a cousin. My dad had a brother and a sister. And the day my dad died, which was 10 years ago on the 30th of this month, so just a few weeks in front of us here, the day he passed away, we're sitting in the dining room waiting for the coroner to come, the funeral home to come and take his body away, and his brother calls to tell him that he just learned that their sister has passed away. So my uncle learns in the same day that he's the last one of his family to be alive. And he's never been part of my life. I've probably been in his presence 3 to 5 times in my entire life. And I write in the book about him, and that I wouldn't know him if he saw me, and he wouldn't know me if he saw me. And my cousin, his daughter, came to my event in Olympia, and she said, you wrote about that, and actually he reads your newsletter. He's the one who told me that you were going to be in Olympia, and I was moved by that, and he's still up in Plains, and I want to go see him. So then I go out on the East Coast tour, and I'm driving from Richmond, Virginia to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Unknowingly to me, I passed right by Carlisle, which of course is where ground zero of the boarding school era in the United States started. So I stopped there. And, after being in Richmond, where they have the Hollywood Cemetery that's got all these monuments to all these Confederate dudes and all these graves, and then there's Gettysburg, which is like the other side of the Civil War, which is all these monuments to where every battalion was stationed and where every artillery was, and I swear to God, all these Civil War dudes must have brought a gym with them, because they're all just buff, up there on their horses, and they just built shit houses, what's the term for that? Brick shit houses, whatever. And Carlisle is a military base, an army base, and you have to pass security clearance to even get in there. And there's this one tiny little sign talking about how it was where the boarding school started. And I find that just magnificently offensive, because that is, like I said, ground zero to one of the darkest periods that affected every single tribe. Every single indigenous person in North America is connected to the boarding school era, whether directly through family members or personally or friends, whatever. It touches all of us. And people would always ask me, well, does anybody in your family go to boarding school? And I said, not to my knowledge, but I'm sure people in their community certainly did. So I come home from Pennsylvania. 2 days later, I get a text from my cousin. Her name's Paige. She said, I was just talking to Dad this morning on the phone, my uncle, and he told me this is the first time this truth has been shared in my family, that my grandfather went to the Ursuline boarding school in St. Ignatius. We never knew. And yet, that answers every question about why he felt the way he did, the kind of person he was, the way his trauma played out in the rest of the family. It's like I was almost hyperventilating. And it's a profound revealing that never would have happened if I hadn't started learning this stuff. And I tell people all the time that and this gets a little woo-woo, but I don't care, because I believe it. None of this that has happened for me should have happened for someone like me. I don't have the education. I have a high school diploma. I never cared about any of that stuff. Yet I have had opportunities open for me that are amazing. And I have felt the influence, the hands of my ancestors on me every step of the way. And just the way that story unfolded, that knowledge needed to come to our family. And it's like I was prepared for it. The fact that I happened to be in Carlisle, and then just a couple days later, I learned of this reality that affected our family for 80 years, 90 years, you know? And what does that mean? And who else does that affect? Look at the role of my uncle, who has never been part of my life. All of a sudden, he plays just this pivotal moment role in this ongoing story. I have no idea how I went down that tangent. But this is our story, this is my family story, but it plays out in every community of Indigenous people related to this. And all of the records from the Ursulines just landed in the basement of the Montana Historical Society, and I'm going to twist every arm I can get to get my nose into those and just find out exactly when and what and who and all of that stuff. Any other questions? Yes.
I sent my book request to Missoula, and you did a great signing for my daughter, who is Little Shell. And I asked you to write "Never Stop Owning Yourself," because I had read that in your material. I'd love for you to expound on that, and a two-parter. Is your son kind of following in your generational healing and the work you're doing, and what more could we do with our kids who are busy on Instagram and doing their thing to connect in, and they're interested and intrigued, and we went to the powwow up in Great Falls, but what more can we do to connect them in as well?
My son just got enrolled a few months ago. He wasn't sure how to feel about it, and I didn't push him. But then he got really interested about a year ago, and he just was enrolled earlier this spring or late winter last year. So he is definitely kind of on that path now also. You know, it's hard because me growing up in a family that denied their Indigenous heritage is ubiquitous. In every tribe, every community, there are people like that because there was good reasons. You know, when my dad was growing up in central Montana, there were still signs in stores that said no breeds allowed, you know, and he had to fight. You know, they moved to Hamilton, which is not a native community, and he certainly looked more Indian than I do, and, you know, his life was so different from mine, and that is across the board for everybody. So, you know, the story of how our culture and our languages through the boarding schools were literally beaten out of us. The people who retained that did not pass it along because they didn't want us to suffer for speaking it the way they did. And the brutality that is documented in all kinds of books now, I mean, it's not hard to find. And if it wasn't for the unearthing of all of those unmarked graves in Canada a few years ago, I don't know that we would still if we would be talking about it yet. You know, it was a huge thing. And, you know, and one of the things I say about Native people all the time is if you ask 10 Indians a question, you're going to get 8 different answers, and the other 2 are going to argue why the other 9 aren't even Indians. So there's a lot of ignorance in our own community, Little Shell community, about who we are and where we come from. And then there's also a lot of ignorance in other communities about who we are and where we come from. And as a Little Shell person, there's been times when I feel like, you know, they suffer this idea of, well, you're not even a real Indian. You know, you're more white than you are Indian. Well, the whole blood thing is a construct created and handed to us by the feds as a way to disconnect us from who we are. And, you know, I just tell people, you know, do your best to live according to like our original instructions. Learn what you can about our culture, and there's plenty of places to do that if you're interested. I'm not that, I used to really worry about like at our tribal meetings and things, there was like, I'm like the youngest dude there, you know, but when I was a teenager, I didn't care about anything but what was right in front of my face. And most of us kind of find that thing a little later in life. And, you know, as long as we get more and more like 30-year-olds getting involved, and that gets a little younger, it's a long game. We have this idea that if we can't make changes or do things in, you know, have the idea Monday, and if it's not fully functional by Sunday, it's like, fuck it. You know, but it's a long game, and you know it is for me too. And I hardly know anything, but I know more than I did a year ago, which is way more than I knew 10 years ago. If I knew the answer to how to inspire kids, I'd be getting paid like 15 grand right now talking to somebody else somewhere else. The question in the back.
In the new book, there's history and personal and anger and cynicism and humor, and then
Cynicism?
all for it. There's prayer. And so it's a beautiful relief in the story, and I wonder if there's more to it than that.
More to kind of those more traditional themes, I guess? Is that what you're asking?
It seems like you come to prayer,
Yeah.
and it gives you like a tease, you know, what does that really mean to you, or would it mean to us if we understood it better?
I like to use pop culture references sometimes to kind of make a point. It's like I talk about like any of these towns, especially like Fort Benton, and we have this idea that it was very black and white people, Indians or whatever, and I like to make the analogy that based on all of the different cultures who were coming to Montana, and that the steamboats were bringing, and there's the gold rush and land and all of that things. It was more like the bar in Star Wars. Like if you went into a place in Fort Benton, all these languages and cultures all mixed together. You remember that? And there's music playing, probably fiddle, and weird looking people talking different languages, and these guys are making a deal, and these two are killing each other and all that. I mean, Fort Benton was literally that. So I want to say that kind of the hinting at prayer and traditional is like the end of Empire Strikes Back, and Darth Vader says, "Luke, I am your father." And that's the end of the movie. You're like, shit! Now what? That is definitely part of what the next book is going to be. Because that was a long way to say, "Luke, I'm your father." The thing with a book like this, that every time I go back and edit it, there are sections that, I've evolved from the time that I first read it, or wrote it. And I had to put these fences around. I need this to live in the time that I was writing it and living it, and not influence it too much by who I am now. And a lot of the cultural stuff and where I am now and what I'm doing is different than it was in 2021 or 2022 when I was writing a particular part. For example, I have these tattoos that I've added to my forearm, and in the little shell, the Elder Society decided we are going to use the 7 grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe people as like our code for who we are and how we should live. And so it's 7 principles, for the idea being that if you live according to those 7 principles, then you are living an Anishinaabe life. And to live in an Anishinaabe life, every footstep becomes a prayer. And I just love that idea. And each one of those 7 is represented by an animal. And that's what I have tattooed in my forearm. Is just kind of in the same way that I put 574 on my knuckles so I would never forget that number. That is what this is for, is my walking reminder of how I should be living my life. And, this is key to my every waking moment, but it was not when I was writing the book. So whatever this is, and I feel like that guiding by my ancestors that I was talking about have created experiences that I have lived since then that I think are going to, if not be directly depicted in the book have certainly influenced what it is that I'm thinking and working on. And yeah, that's a big part of it. That kind of the working idea in my head is like becoming Anishinaabe, that there's no way I would use that. That's just like my working title. Because that's the next thing, you know, what I've learned about language, what I've learned about cultural recovery. I'm going to Turtle Mountain next week for a language conference. You know, when I started this book, there's no way I ever imagined I'd be keynoting on a reservation the importance of language recovery, you know, and it's just constantly unfolding. I'm sure other writers encounter that also. You know, where you end is different from where you begin, and then when you go back to fix all the shit you didn't care about the first time through, you have to kind of build fences around stuff. Yes?
I'm really interested in language recovery.
Uh-huh.
And wondering if there are any programs in place right now to help the Métis language stay alive. And also, if you think the Métis language has like a unique worldview embedded in it that is not present in other languages.
Yeah, so the question is, are there language recovery efforts for Métis in the United States, and does Métis have, you know, kind of that connection to the land embedded in it like other indigenous languages do? I'll answer the second half first. I don't know that Michif does as much as like straight up Anishinaabe does or Cree does or whatever, because it is a mix also. But there's so much of that verbiage in Michif that it's certainly more connected than English is. I know Turtle Mountain has a Michif program that they had a grant for, and I don't know if it still exists or not. You know, part of that problem is, excuse me, is the fact that the United States doesn't recognize Métis as a people, so that makes it difficult to double down on Michif. I can say Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, you know, our last fluent first language speaker of Ojibwe in Montana died during COVID. So we don't have any first language speaking Ojibwe speakers in our community in Montana currently. What that means is you're born into a household where the language spoken in the home that you learn first is your indigenous language. So we have this huge task ahead of us of how are we going to handle this? How are we going to solve this problem? I feel like our language program is one of those things we're kind of failing on as in the Little Shell community. I know we're making some changes, and that's part of why I'm going to Turtle Mountain next week to this conference, is because, you know, I have a partner who works in developing native language courses for tribes online for the Montana Digital Academy, who have a mandate from the legislature that says, as part of our Indian Ed for All, related to that, is that you have to have these language courses available to tribes. But the tribes aren't obligated to do it, and a couple have chosen not to. And one of the challenges they found is finding people who can actually teach it once the class has been developed. So we're going out there like, we're gonna start making an Ojibwe one on our own. And then if the Little Shell want to adopt it, awesome. If not, we're gonna have it available for anybody who wants to do it. Because my feeling about language is it's like all hands on deck. Whatever we have to do to make these languages return to the people who need to speak them, we have to do it. And we have to use anybody who's willing to contribute to that. And it's actually in the current issue of Montana Quarterly where I was able to, I feel like the greatest, I may never do another interview again because I feel like I've said the best thing I'm ever going to see and say in an interview. Because she asked me about language and the difference between indigenous languages and a language like English that is not tied to this land in the way that native languages are. And if I recall correctly, I told her that trying to connect to the land with English is like trying to eat a buffalo roast with a straw. You're gonna slurp up some really tasty juices, but you're never gonna get to the meat of it. I mean, I think that's pretty poetic. That's why I'm the poet laureate, ladies and gentlemen. But it's true. You know, another friend of mine who speaks Salish, she's the first person to get a master's degree in linguistics from the University of Montana in Salish. And her master's thesis was on how there's 41 ways in Salish to describe going from here to there. And that is profound because it depends on distance and weather and time of year and what direction you're going and all of these things that in English we're just like, well, I'm gonna go over there. Well, where? You know, and it's a connect, and it's almost incomprehensible to us because it's such a different way of viewing the world. But it's when you start getting glimpses of it, it's beautiful, and I think it's just important that those things live in the world. I get asked a lot by people like, is it okay if I use your language? You know, say things like hello or whatever. And it's like, well, if you go to France, don't you feel like you should learn how to say hello and goodbye and, you know, order a bagel or what is it, French? Croissant. Baguette, that's what I was thinking of. In French, out of respect for you're in their country, well, it's the same thing. If you learn how to say hello and some things in the land of a people that you've kind of replaced, I think that's a way to respect where you are and who you're living beside. Anything else? Any other questions? Yes.
I'll make this short, but I spent a lot of time in Wales in England, and the Welsh people lost their language, but they had a written language. And I wondered if that's part of the problem for the native languages they're trying to build. There isn't a written language. Or there is a written language and people just don't know about it, or?
Well, like Anishinaabe is not a written language. And there's also factions within Native communities saying, well, we never had a written language, we shouldn't teach a written language. So that is one of those conflicts we have in Native communities. And, you know, my license plate says Gagagi on it. It's Gagagii, and it's Raven in Anishinaabe, but technically it should be Gaagaagi, but it's mutable and it still means the same thing. And you know, I don't know if the lack of writing, part of the problem with reviving languages is we do it wrong. So we are in an English immersive world where everything we do, every concept, every science, every social thing we want to interact with is in English. We're immersed in it. You can't teach indigenous languages outside of immersive schools because you can't learn it in 40 minutes, 3 days a week, and then the rest of your life you're immersed in something else. And when the Pope came to Canada a few years ago, like 3 years ago, whenever that was, and did the whole reconciliation dog and pony show, and nothing happened. There's this Métis artist named Christy Belcourt who, you know, back to the previous dumpster fire version Twitter was before the current dumpster fire version it is. She posted on there that if the Catholics really wanted to reconcile with indigenous people for what was done through the boarding school era, they would fully fund in language immersion schools all over North America for 100 years. They could do it. I mean, it's like, well, actually, that's a great idea. Because if anybody can afford it, they can. And that is how you learn a language, and it has to happen at home. And I mean, the odds are so stacked against people learning it if they can't be immersed in it. Like if you want to really learn Spanish, you go to a Spanish-speaking country and you're immersed in it. There's nowhere you can go in North America outside of a Native community who has an immersion school where you could be immersed in that language. And that is one of those huge, long game hurdles we have to overcome.
Thank you.
Yes, in the back.
So Chris, in this land of Montana, where people say, oh, I'm sixth generation Montana, or I'm pure Irish. I'm a Michigan mutt. And I didn't know who I was until I heard of you about 6 weeks ago. And I told my partner, there's a name for who I am. I'm Michigan, raised in Mount Pleasant, around the Chippewa. My last name Martin, which Google says is the #1 French surname. Michigan. And my blood says I got exactly what you described, and I didn't know who I was or what I was until you told me. So thank you very much that I met someone I relate to, like literally. I feel like it's a sense of belonging. And speaking woo-woo, like I remember there was a day when I went to the Chippewa Reservation where they have a museum with stones. And the stones are labeled like hope and joy. And we were explained that these stones have been prayed over by ancestors, which I didn't know were my ancestors. I was just visiting and checking out Chippewa Native Americans. But as I went through the room, I just started sobbing. And I thought, oh my God, I gotta get my shit together. I'm like PMSing or something. You don't walk out of here crying like this. And I came out and she goes, yeah. Yeah, and I realized, oh my God, my soul speaks the language even though I don't.
Yeah. No, I think that's a legitimate experience. There's this great book called Sand Talk by a guy named Tyson Yunkaporta. He's an indigenous Australian guy. And there's a chapter in there about this place where there's all these rocks and all these tourists take and I'm doing a terrible job paraphrasing this, but these tourists come and they take these rocks and horrible things start happening to them, and then they send the rocks back. And you know, it's a thing. And like I said, I'm doing a terrible job paraphrasing. There are places of power, and there's no denying that. And I firmly believe that the reason why a place like Yellowstone is just so overwhelming to so many people is because it is one of those places of power. And from my perspective, it's one of the only places, one of only two places that I go that I know where all 7 of our grandfathers still live together in one community. And there is spiritual power in that. And I think that connects to people who don't even realize that that's where it's coming from. And there are holy places all over the world. And I think they are all touching that same, whatever that source of energy is. And we all have those experiences in different ways. And that's part of it. Oh, welcome back. I thought you were going to say, yeah, I learned who I was 6 weeks ago, and now I'm flirting midship or something like that.
No, thank you so much.
Thank you. Are we getting close?
Yeah, can we do like one more?
One more? Yes.
I'm curious, you've really become like a spokesperson for this culture. How does that feel, like stepping into that responsibility, and how have you been accepted by other people in the culture?
I mean, it's heavy, you know. I don't, like, it's not like I chose to do it, it's just happened. And, you know, the tribe has, like at our powwow, they gifted me and our tribal chairman and our cultural guy blankets, and we did a thing, and, you know, they made a big deal out of it. And, you know, one of my concerns with this book is in Native communities, we don't like people to draw attention to themselves. So what does my publisher do? They put my freaking face on the cover of the book. And I've been really worried about that. My face is on a freaking billboard in Great Falls right now for a Get Out the Vote campaign. And I've really struggled with that. That idea, like, well, fucking Maitreya's just out there. He's probably cashing checks right now, you know? Because it's always been about the community. And, you know, I don't, it's, like I said, it's not all me, man. I feel like every step I've taken to get to this point, I used to have a job I hated, yet I learned these skills to get up in front of crowds and be pretty fearless, whether there's 10 people or 1,000. Where I freak out is like, as soon as this is over and people are talking to me, that's when I'm like, oh shit, you know? That's where I struggle. But in that kind of the spokesperson role, I'm confident and comfortable, and I can look every single one of you in the eye and be willing to connect with you, but it's the one-on-one stuff that's a little more difficult. And, you know, I enjoy it. And I was telling my friend earlier, you know, I used to, in these kind of intertribal gatherings where you have the 10 Indians arguing about everything, and I used to kind of take a back seat. And, you know, then I realized, you know, I know as much about my people and my culture as any of these other people do. And when they established the Elder Society, you know, my cousin who was on the tribal council at the time called me and said, hey, how old are you? And I said, well, at the time I was like 55. And I said, 55? She said, okay, She goes, we want to know how old you are because we want to make sure that the age that you have to be for the Elder Society is how old you are. So like they based the decision on what an elder is in the Little Shell tribe on how old freaking Matrey is, you know? And it's just happening, Lauren, and I just do it. I enjoy it, but it is tiring sometimes. Well, with that question, Mark, I guess we're done.
Yeah.
Thank you. Chili Glitch, thank you very much. What a great turnout. What a great conversation. I really, really appreciate every single one of you. And Mark, I appreciate the opportunity.